This story of Brian Benson and his dog Magnus paints an incredibly emotional and touching scene, where the bond between a man and his service dog transcends words and medicine. It's a testament to the power of love, loyalty, and connection between humans and their pets. Magnus had been by Brian's side through thick and thin, and as Brian faced the possibility of losing his battle with a hereditary heart condition, the dog's instincts kicked in. Animals, especially dogs, often seem to have an innate sense of their owner's emotions and physical state, especially service dogs like Magnus, who are trained to assist in times of crisis. The story reaches its most poignant moment when Magnus, sensing Brian's weakening condition, places his paw on Brian's chest in a gesture that speaks volumes. It's as if Magnus knew exactly what Brian needed, not just physical comfort, but an emotional connection, a sense that he wasn't alone. The gentle hum Magnus emits, like a soothing lullaby, highlights the dog's deep understanding of the situation, offering calm and solace when everything around them seemed so chaotic. What makes this moment even more extraordinary is how Brian's body responded to Magnus's presence. The medical staff, in awe of the dog's apparent impact, watched Brian's vital signs improve. Whether it was a psychological or physical response, it's clear that the deep bond between Brian and Magnus had a tangible effect on his health. Magnus's love quite literally breathed life back into Brian. This touching story highlights the power of the human-animal bond, how, in moments of crisis, the connection we share with our pets can bring profound emotional and even physical healing. It speaks to the deep emotional intelligence animals possess and reminds us that love and companionship, even from a four-legged friend, can be the difference between life and death. As Brian's heart steadied, the once frantic scene in the emergency room turned into one filled with awe and quiet respect. The medical staff, initially focused on life-saving measures, now found themselves witnesses to something beyond the science and medicine they had been trained in. The connection between Brian and Magnus was almost palpable, an unspoken language of love, loyalty, and trust. Magnus, still gently humming, never broke his gaze from Brian. It was as though he knew that his role was far from over. In those moments, the dog became more than just a companion. He was Brian's protector, healer, and lifeline. And Brian, weak but now stable, could only offer tears of gratitude for the gift Magnus had given him, another chance. As Brian lay there, his hands softly resting on Magnus's head, memories of their life together flooded his mind. He thought about the day he had picked Magnus up as a pup, how tiny and full of energy he had been. He remembered the long nights when his illness had kept him awake, and how Magnus had curled up beside him, providing silent comfort. Magnus had been there through hospital visits, surgeries, and moments of despair when Brian thought he couldn't go on. But now, Brian realized Magnus wasn't just a witness to his pain, he was an active force in his survival. It was almost as if the dog had absorbed his suffering, channeling his love back into Brian, giving him the strength to fight. The doctors, inspired by what they had witnessed, continued to work with a renewed sense of hope. They had seen firsthand the emotional and physiological power that love and companionship could have, and it reminded them of the human side of their profession where science met the soul. Hours later, after the immediate danger had passed, Brian was transferred to a quieter room to rest. Magnus, ever faithful, never left his side. The hospital staff, deeply moved by the bond they had witnessed, made sure that Magnus could stay with Brian during his recovery. In the days that followed, as Brian regained his strength, Magnus became somewhat of a local hero in the hospital. Nurses and doctors would stop by the room, not just to check on Brian's progress, but to marvel at the dog who had done what seemed impossible. Some would sit beside Magnus, petting him, sharing their admiration for the way he had saved his owner's life not just once, but over the course of their 9 years together. Brian, now recovering, made a quiet promise to Magnus as they sat together one evening in the hospital room, the moonlight streaming in. "I owe you everything, "Buddy," he whispered, stroking the dog's fur. "I don't know how you knew, but you saved me. We're not done yet." Magnus, lying peacefully beside him, thumped his tail softly, as if to say, "I know." The bond between them had always been strong, but now it was something unbreakable. Brian knew that Magnus wasn't just his service dog, he was his guardian angel, a reminder that love, in its purest form, can heal even the deepest wounds. In the days and weeks that followed, Brian's health continued to improve. Eventually, he was well enough to leave the hospital and return home, with Magnus walking proudly by his side. Though his battle with illness wasn't completely over, Brian now faced the future with renewed hope, knowing that with Magnus by his side, he had the strength to face whatever came next. The story of Brian and Magnus became a powerful reminder to everyone who heard it. It wasn't just a story of survival, but of the extraordinary bond between humans and animals, a bond that, in this case, had truly made all the difference. As Brian and Magnus returned home, the familiarity of their surroundings brought a sense of peace. The cozy living room, with Magnus's favorite spot by the window, felt like a haven. Brian sat on the couch, watching his loyal companion curl up beside him. The weight of what they had been through lingered, but instead of fear, Brian now felt a sense of deep gratitude. The days that followed were filled with quiet recovery. Brian still had medical appointments and therapies to attend, but Magnus never left his side. Every morning, the two would take slow, peaceful walks around their neighborhood. Neighbors who had heard about what had happened would stop to greet them, offering words of encouragement. Many had witnessed the incredible strength of their bond, and it seemed as though Magnus had become a local celebrity. One evening, as Brian rested on the couch with Magnus at his feet, he received a call from a journalist who had heard their story. Word had spread about the incredible way Magnus had intervened in the hospital, and now people were eager to learn more. Reluctant at first, Brian eventually agreed to an interview, feeling that sharing their experience might inspire others who were struggling. A few days later, a journalist visited their home. Magnus, ever calm and protective, stayed close to Brian throughout the conversation. As Brian recounted the events in the hospital, his voice wavered with emotion, but he smiled as he spoke about how Magnus had saved him. The journalist was captivated, not just by the facts of the story, but by the undeniable connection between man and dog. The article, once published, went viral. It was shared across social media platforms, and soon, news outlets from all over reached out to feature their story. Brian was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support from people worldwide. Messages flooded in from others who had been touched by the story of Magnus's heroism. Some shared stories of their own pets who had helped them through difficult times. Others simply expressed how hearing about Magnus had given them hope. In the following weeks, Brian and Magnus were invited to appear on several television shows and podcasts. Each time, Brian emphasized the importance of recognizing the intelligence and emotional sensitivity of animals. He spoke about how Magnus had always been attuned to his needs, but that day in the hospital had been something truly extraordinary. One interview in particular stood out. A veterinarian specializing in service animals had heard their story and wanted to meet Magnus. After examining Magnus and talking with Brian, the vet explained something remarkable. Magnus's response to Brian in the emergency room had been part of his service training, but his ability to calm Brian's heart rhythm with such precision was beyond ordinary. The vet suggested that Magnus possessed an unusually strong intuitive bond with Brian, one that went beyond his training, tapping into something deeply emotional and even physiological. Moved by the vet's insights, Brian began to see his relationship with Magnus in a new light. He had always known that Magnus was special, but now it seemed as though their bond was something rare, something almost magical. As their story continued to gain attention, Brian decided to use his platform to raise awareness about service dogs and the vital roles they play in people's lives. He began volunteering with local organizations that trained service animals, sharing his story to inspire others to support these programs. Through these efforts, Brian found a new sense of purpose. He had spent so much time focusing on his illness, but now he saw a way to give back. Magnus, meanwhile, continued to thrive. His calm demeanor and unwavering loyalty never wavered. And while he remained humble in his role, it was clear to everyone who met him that he was no ordinary dog. People often asked Brian if they could meet Magnus, and though Magnus always remained his gentle, quiet self, there was something about him that seemed to touch everyone who crossed his path. Years passed, and though Brian's health remained fragile, he and Magnus continued to live each day to the fullest. The media attention eventually died down, but their story remained a source of inspiration for many. Brian wrote a book about his journey, not just about his illness, but about the profound connection he had with Magnus and the ways it had saved his life. The book became a bestseller, and through its pages, Brian and Magnus's story continued to touch hearts all over the world. In the end, what had started as a moment of crisis in the emergency room had become a life-changing experience for both Brian and Magnus. Their bond was more than just the love between a man and his dog. It was a testament to the power of companionship, loyalty, and the healing force of love. Magnus had given Brian more than just a second chance at life. He had given him a reason to believe in something greater, something unexplainable, deeply real. And as they sat together on the porch one evening, watching the sun set on another day, Brian leaned down to Magnus and whispered, "We made it, buddy." "Thanks to you, we made it," Magnus, as always, responded with a gentle nuzzle, his soft eyes reflecting the love that had carried them both through so much. Their journey together was far from over, but whatever came next, they would face it side by side just as they always had.